This is the 51st episode of the Effective Executive podcast and YouTube videos. And this week, I wanted to discuss common sense and quick fixes. Now, one of the red flags I get in working with executives is when they say something like, oh, it's only common sense that somebody would do it this way, whatever this way might be. And it got me to thinking about a quote from Peter Drucker. There is surely nothing quite so useless as doing with great efficiency what should not be done at all. And so this is what I wanted to talk about this week. It's the heart of being an effective executive. If you've listened to, and it's probably already scrolled by, but you listen to the playlist of how to get started with being an effective executive. It begins with looking at doing things right versus doing the right things. And, what we want to do is achieve doing things right, but more importantly, that we're doing the right things. So I'm going to go through a few examples. I'm going to start with basically a systems component and looking at different ways people address this. And starting very big picture, one of the things I hear a lot about today, and I started researching it a little bit and getting into it more deeply as I went on, because it really does affect almost every country, is electric vehicles. And there's this big push, we're incentivizing people here in the United States to buy electric vehicles. And there's a lot of hype behind it with Tesla. And now all sorts of automakers are out there. They're going to have their electric vehicles out there. But when I look at the broader system that is out there, what I see is an infrastructure that's missing to be able to support this. Now, in the U.S., we've got problems with electrical grids. This came out over the winter in California and in Texas. And, these are really problematic things. And as I dug into it more deeply, what you discover is, first of all, the whole idea behind electric vehicles is to kind of save our environment. But over 60% of the energy used for electricity, as well as manufacturing electric vehicles, comes from hydrocarbons. So we're not really achieving what we think we're achieving. We're just kind of, we have electric vehicles that are being mandated in California. That's great, but somebody's making it somewhere, and then they're having to use the hydrocarbons to make it. Along with that, we don't have the electrical infrastructure that if everybody in the United States had an electric car, we would not have the ability to charge them all. It's just our infrastructure isn't there. Our electrical infrastructure isn't there to be able to achieve this. So, this goes to, a thinking of a failure to look at the whole versus the parts. I'm for green energy. Cool. I'm good with it. I think it should evolve as opposed to be a revolution. Everybody just run out and get an electric vehicle. It can't happen. We don't have the infrastructure to do it. And so this kind of absolutism that we have going on and has always been in our country leads to these quick fixes and, it's just common sense. All we have to do is go and put together electric vehicles, and then the unintended consequences start, right? And this is very useful information to be able to use within as an executive within your own organization, is understanding that common sense isn't so common, and neither are quick fixes. So simple solutions to complex problems is an absolute type of thinking that leads to unintended consequences, which I talked about last week. And so common sense leads to things like that we're going to see, that we see in government, like one size fits all. Everybody needs to be locked down in their house. What are the unintended consequences of that? What if I live in a cabin by myself in North Dakota? I mean, that's extreme, but at the same time, because we just try to get solutions that are a one size fits all, the unintended consequences of these things lead to all types of issues and problems. And we can also look at, and I've talked about this before in some other videos and in the podcast, is downsizing, and that it's ineffective. 2/3 of companies doing downsizing in a particular year are likely to do it the following year. So what are we doing when we're doing downsizing? And I have a number of things I work with executives on with regards to alternatives to doing downsizing. Everything from being able to cut salaries 10% across the board. There's a number of solutions. Put excess people on looking for improvements. That's something that Toyota has done in the past. But there are a number of things that I've worked on with executives to avoid that particular situation. And it's interesting when you step back and you look at different forms of government. In a capitalistic society, there's one of the problems is you get political unrest when there's not enough equitable distribution in a particular environment. And in socialism and communism, there's insufficient production of wealth. Well, I'd rather at least have the problem in a capitalistic society of finding ways to get people to participate in the wealth that's created than not having any. And so sometimes when we look at these things, we have to kind of step back and say, all right, what's going on here? Now, one of the things that causes problems with executives is production excesses. So in other words, the sales are not increasing as fast as the productivity improvement. We're putting out more things and therefore creating more inventory in our particular system. And because now we have excess inventory, we now have to lay some people out because we don't need that particular productivity. And this is one of the reasons why I'm such a big proponent of having in your organization, doesn't have to be my method, but a method to innovate. And that will allow you to have people constantly working on new products and services that can absorb this excess that may exist within your system. Now, one other thing that I want to mention here is benchmarking. And this, again, benchmarking is typically done at the parts level. We have a piece where we have the best practice for this particular part. And we, by virtue of having these best practices for each of the parts, there's the assumption that when we put the parts all together, that we'll have this great thing. But that's where we're missing the synthetic thinking, where we need to be able to look at the whole and not the parts in order to assess what our particular system is doing. And that's why I'm not a proponent of best practices because they're born typically, not always, but 95% of the time, they're born from someone looking at a piece of a process, of a department, of whatever, and they're benchmarking against a part of the organization. So this is kind of a prelude. I use some of this material. It actually goes into a little bit more depth in my decision-making module or my decision-making method. If we're going to make good decisions, we got to begin with synthetic thinking. To be able to look at that so we don't get the unintended consequences, and that we don't have all of this absolutism that's going on where we're using common sense and one size fits all, and all of this thinking that happens in executives' minds. So that's what I wanted to cover this week, and we'll catch you next week.